Hello, everyone, and welcome to another LinkedIn Live episode where I get a chance to interview some great CEOs from tech vendors in the marketplace. I'm Tom Lewis. I lead TTEC Digital's consulting and analytics and alliance partner program. With me today is Raj Koneru, the CEO of Kore.ai. Raj, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Tom. How are you?
Fantastic. I can't, when we have these discussions, we talk about the industry, technology, those sorts of things. But in this case, I'm going to highlight one thing that from an accolade perspective relative to Core, and that is you are the upper right Magic Quadrant in Gartner's Magic Quadrant study from last year. So I wanted to congratulate you from that.
Thank you, Tom.
There's a lot of vendors in that space. And there's a lot of excitement around AI, conversational AI, chatbots, those sorts of things. My first question for you today, if you don't mind, is get your perspective on where you think the market is going relative to using conversational AI, generative AI in self-service, customer service organizations. It's a very broad question, I realize, but good.
I mean, it's an apt question. I mean, if you look back, and then I'll tell you what I think is happening looking forward. When you look back before the LLMs became available, the ML models like CNN, DNN, predictive models mostly, which required a lot of training, were being used, to build this natural language, conversational AI-based chatbots and voice bots. Voice bots require a little more work in terms of integrating with the CCaaS systems and the contact center systems, speech recognition, text-to-speech engines, but those are just integrations. The core of it was, how do you understand what the user said and how do you respond? Now with the LLMs coming into play, a lot of the tasks that you had to do, to be able to create that experience have changed and in some cases simplified. Firstly, the LLMs are trained on world knowledge, but so their ability to recognize intent and extract entities from a user's utterance has become better, basically. And, the hallucination effect, which LLMs are famous for, are not so important when all you're trying to do is understand the intent and extract the entities. The training required for your bot is reduced significantly. And if you do need to give some training, you can have LLMs generate the training for you. They can also generate test utterances for you. But when it comes to the execution of the flow of a conversation, that has mostly been scripted, either with code or with us, like with no code. And the response back from the bot was also had to be scripted. And the scripting and the logic execution has its value because it's then scripted. It only goes down certain paths that you make it go down. Now that is also going forward, changing to some extent, and it's yet to be seen how customer service organizations feel comfortable with this change, which is the concept of agentic, AI agents. What does that mean, right? The simple thing with an agentic AI agent is you don't create that scripted flow. You give instructions to a model and give it some constraints in the instructions about what it should do.
Right.
And you give it certain tools like, backend API calls, some code which you write to implement some logic. And the model decides, which tool to invoke that you gave it at different points in time, and makes the conversation feel and look very, very, very natural, in that regard. But you are giving control of that flow to the model. So
Right.
You're losing some control in the process. And that is where hallucinations could potentially creep in. Now you can have guardrails that also apply to the input given to the model and the output that comes out of the model. But that's only as much that you can imagine. Those guardrails are only as good as that you can imagine the kind of hallucinations that may come out.
Right.
So the future is still in the making in terms of how these models will be used. But I imagine it'll be a combination of the scripted component and the autonomous component.
Yeah.
And simple transactions and simple flows will use the models and leave it to the model. The more complex transactions and flows will have a certain component of the flow being autonomous and other components being scripted. So that hybrid mechanism is going to be the future. So what does that mean for a customer service organization? You get a more natural language flow, which is not scripted only,
Right.
but yet you get control to implement the business rules and the business logic you want to implement in that flow, basically. And I think that's going to make the end user, the consumer or the customer of the customer service organization's experience much better, basically. And it's also going to make it easier to create these experiences with the right tools like ours that you could use to build those experiences.
So I caught a couple of things in there that if I was listening to this conversation and trying to figure out when and how much and sort of how I would develop my strategy for my company specifically, one thing I heard was sort of using the right tool at the right point and the right flows based on what your specific needs are. And so, which is sort of same as it ever was. In other words, IVRs would use DTMF where it made sense to capture things a lot, touch tone to capture things like that. And then they'd be, more creative in other areas. So, okay, fine. So it's evolving or widening the aperture of tools to be used and options to be taken. Great. And then the other one was, when you think about Gen AI, what I heard you say was using it as interpreting the intent. So not necessarily the conversation out, which is what you talked about later, but even just using it for understanding the intent of the caller is a tremendous asset. Do I have sort of both of those things right based on what you summarized at the start?
Yes, I mean the intent and the entity extraction piece, I think the LLMs can do a fine job right now in almost every language and for any number of intents that you want to provide as your functionality. The tools part, the difference between what you mentioned, like DTMF or versus voice-enabled speech versus whatever, I think the world has now gone to a point where it has to be natural language. The consumer should be able to say what he or she wants in a very natural way, in a verbose way if required, if they want to, and the bot has to respond. So in that is where the concept of a scripted flow versus an autonomous flow come into play. How do you make that two-way conversation between the consumer and the bot feel natural to the consumer, but on the side of the bot, how do you make sure that it is adhering to the rules and the logic? And therefore the use of models in a certain way with the right tools is the key deciding factor going forward to be able to achieve that goal of making it truly conversational, completely conversational, purely conversational.
Yeah. So I've talked about this and written a few articles on this notion that customer experience as it relates to use of technology, bots in general, voice and digital bots, is going down. And let me give you the context for this. For organizations where they maybe have advanced capabilities today, but haven't evolved recently, consumers engage with those bots and are dissatisfied more today than the exact same bot they would have engaged with a year earlier, because they have this perception that my 8-year-old can use ChatGPT and have a conversation with a thing. Why is it so structured and stilted and horrible experience? Not that it's horrible because it's the same as it was a year ago, but rather that my expectations have risen. And when you think about the capabilities of everything you just talked about in terms of the setup and where this is going, I guess my question is, where will we see consumers? When do you think, using your technology or others, where will we see consumers say, this is easier to use and than it ever was, and that curve, we sort of hit the bottom, and the customer experience with these sorts of things start to increase? Is that tomorrow, 5 years, 10 years?
Well, I mean, that's very generic, right? I mean, what
Yep,
you're asking, right?
it is.
But if you break it down and if you look at the data, I mean, we've been providing conversational AI platform for 10 years now. We have 500 large enterprises that have deployed a voice bot or a chat bot in different channels. And when we look at the data of usage, it classify the use of the bot and being able to stay with the bot and feel satisfied to complete what they want to do with the bot, is increasing. It starts with the simple stuff and
Right.
the medium complex stuff and the heavily complex stuff. So what we haven't seen is the stuff which is more complex, most complex, is ending up with the agent. The simple stuff, people are staying with the bot and completing what they have to do, more than what they used to do with more of the legacy IVRs,
Yeah.
basically. So in the legacy IVRs, if the fallout was, let's say, 50%, from the
Right.
legacy IVR, the fallout
Yep.
from a conversational IVR is much below, what it used to be, like maybe half of that right now.
Yep.
Well, as you move forward and these agentic AI autonomous models or bots are built, and combination of autonomous and scripted comes into play, I think that will move the needle even more,
Yeah.
basically. So it'll move the containment rate even higher, where customers feel comfortable enough because it's very natural to talk to that
Yep.
bot. It's like talking to a human, and it'll move even more in that direction of not requiring to actually talk to a human.
Yeah.
So So when you look at it, very broadly across verticals, across companies, across use cases, you're right. The general theme is, oh, this thing sucks, basically.
Yep.
But, when you look at specifically at use cases within companies, I think you'll see that there is more, good news there than bad news.
Yeah. Yeah. I used to say, and still do, that it's not that people hate IVRs or chatbots; it's that most of them suck, to use your words. And so as these things start to evolve and become more mature and more conversational, truly conversational, obviously that dynamic will change. Something in your last answer, though, when you were talking about, don't let me put words in your mouth, but the iteration from starting one place and sort of expanding scope and use cases and things like that. Are you suggesting that if you're engaging with a client, that you start one place and you sort of address those fundamental use cases, and then there's an iterative campaign of evolving additional use cases versus a let's boil the ocean, set it and forget it kind of, let's do a monolithic implementation? What's more typical in your environment or with your
The
customers?
typical is, walk, crawl, walk, run,
Okay.
basically. That's the best approach because you start, smelling success and you get addicted to it and then add more and add more and add more and you learn along the way. You have to
Yep.
remember that the customer service organizations, the people in those organizations, and the technology teams who support them, their level of knowledge is much lower than, the technology providers, like us, essentially. So they start building their own confidence in their knowledge and their ability to add more functionality as time goes. Every time we've done a big bang project, boil the ocean type of project, it takes far longer, more issues come up, and it all comes down to, in my opinion, only one thing. Okay. The one thing is the knowledge of the people implementing it. Basically, they don't have the knowledge to do the big bang, but they're attempting the big bang.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
doing the crawl, walk, run approach gives them more comfort, basically, and makes it easier to implement.
Yeah. It reminds me of a experience I had where I was advising a hospitality company, and they were very tech savvy. In fact, built lots of the machinery for this themselves, and decided to build a chatbot, essentially self-service kind of capabilities. And they engineered it flawlessly. But the day they launched it, I remember this senior executive called me and said, and we didn't do it. They did it themselves, just to be clear, and said, we just took the thing down. Like, it's only been up for a part of the day. It's like, yeah, the technology worked great, but the users didn't adopt it. And so what ended up happening was they hadn't designed it in anticipation of what information the customers were coming to the conversation with, what their, sort of education around their mindset and things like that. And so when I hear you say about an organization, big bang or otherwise, and the knowledge, they don't know how, part of it is they may or may not know the technology they're using, but part of it is really sort of user behavior, conversational design, things like that. So it is definitely it's an experience as well as a technology. In fact, the technology works. The question is how you go and configure it and write the story to interface with the customer.
Completely agree. I completely agree. And that's why the crawl, walk, run works well, because you do something, you learn from it, and then you adjust, and then add more, you learn from it, you adjust. Because you're learning as you implement. It's not like you're going to college, getting a degree, and then you figure it out, basically. So I completely agree. I mean, there's a lot more that goes into, a lot more thought that needs to go into how do I make the consumer come in and then stay and then go away happy. Basically. And that requires time and thought put into it. So you need business analysts, product managers, you need conversation designers. You need to understand where your containment is falling away and what to target first and what to add more. You need to promote it through marketing. Basically, it's not like you put it out there and people will come.
Right.
Basically, you're trying to change people's behavior, basically, so you need to market it to them. And then that's a big learning. We had a customer in South Korea who put out a chatbot for IT support internally. It's a large company. And they did no promotion. Basically. And 3 months later, they said, the adoption of this thing is not good. We're going to turn it off. And then we sort of worked with them and said, hey, promote it. Explain to people the benefits of it. It's not natural to your employees, and they have like over 100,000 employees. And they did that, and they realized that, people love it. People are not calling the help desk. They're not opening tickets. They're actually going there and solving their problems. It's just that they didn't know this existed.
So it does reinforce the idea that it is more than just the technology, because what was not part of that story was, and the technology had some issues with it. No, it was the promotion in that case. And, some of the examples I used were around, the change management or the user design or things like that. I often use the expression, CX is a journey, not a destination. And so in that context, I think you're saying something similar, which is, crawl, walk, run, evolve. And by the way, the technology, user expectations, as well as adoption and so forth, these things will all evolve. And you need to sort of design your adoption in your company based on that. That's less of a question. Let me get you my last question, which is, if you had the opportunity to talk to a business around the way in which they were thinking about buying your product or any product that competes with yours, what would the 2 or 3 things you would tell them, not necessarily about your product, but the way to think about the project in terms of, some of the things we just talked about today, or anything else that they need to come to the table with in order to have a successful project?
Well, the first most important thing is, what's your pain point? Are you spending too much money on customer service? Or is your pain point that you're not able to hire enough agents and train them fast enough to be efficient? Or you're losing your agents? Or is your pain point that, your data is in too many places and you're not able to bring that data and make it available to provide that customer service, or any other, kind of use case? So pain point is number one.
Well, so let me react to that for a second. So what I often hear is a company says, we need to put in a chatbot, but what you're suggesting, and which is very prudent, which is, let's make sure that we're tied to the stakeholder value, the shareholder value, the ROI, the value realization around. It's not a technology project. It's a little t transformation project, essentially, and make sure that those goals are aligned. So I like that answer.
That's right.
Good. What was your number two?
Number two is, there's a lot of people who say we need to implement Gen AI. Okay, but do you know what is Gen AI? Gen AI generates things, generates text right now,
Yep.
reasonably well. In the future, images, videos, voice, whatever. So there is the what and the why, and then comes the how. And many times people put the how in front of the what and the why. So if you describe the what and the why, you may not need to use Gen AI. You can do with traditional conversational AI. So that's the other piece. And the third piece I'll say is, look at your skill sets in your company. Who's going to own this? Is it the operations team? Is it the IT team? Is it the call center team? Basically, who's going to own it? And then do they have the skill sets to implement something like this? Or are you going to just outsource it as a managed service?
Right.
And once those things are defined, I can give you a solution. I can give you the platform and the services to be able to make this thing successful.
Yeah.
Basically, and I can explain to you within the platform all the tools and capabilities and features that are available to accomplish what you want. So I keep telling my salespeople, stop presenting what we have and focus on asking what they want. The discovery is more important than, professing a solution, because we have all the features. Question is, what do they want to use it for?
Yeah. 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 Well, and if you assume that the technology is going to evolve and is solid and so forth, I often describe a buy versus build around the rest, buy versus build sort of model across the other capabilities. Do you have the core competencies? Can you do it cheaper than, with your internal resources? Can you get it to market quick enough? And is it differentiating enough in the market that you have the unique, sort of product or service in that case, even when they're already deciding to use a technology like yours. So it's a sort of framework I use often to figure out what, should we do this way or whatever. Raj, as always, tremendous conversation. I love having these sort of think tank discussions with you. I appreciate the time very much. And if anybody has any questions about Kore.ai, by all means, reach out to Raj or reach out to me. And anything related to CX, happy to have that conversation as well. So with that, I'll bid you a good day and thank you again, Raj.